Our next presentation for today and our fifth presentation is Digital Assessment of Biologic Width and Exploration of Influencing Factors.
Hello, my name is Caroline, and I'm excited to share with you today our D3 research on the digital assessment of biological width and exploration of influencing factors. Next slide, please. So this is our research team. It involves Dr. Kareem and Dr. Antoine. If you're not familiar with Dr. Antoine, he is one of the 3 periodontal residents that come visit our clinic on Tuesdays, Centerive, and then myself. Next slide. So this is a table of contents, kind of just a visualization for how we're going to progress through the rest of the PowerPoint. Next slide, please. So I want to start out this presentation by refreshing everyone on the biological width. So the biological width is the space between the pocket depth and the alveolar crest of the bone, and we know that it consists of connective tissue attachment and epithelial attachment. So the deepest point in the pocket depth is bound by the epithelial attachment, and then you'll find the connective tissue attachment below that. So throughout the history, there's been lots of various studies trying to evaluate and study the anatomy of the dentogingival apparatus. When I refer to dentogingival apparatus, I'm referring to connective tissue, epithelium attachment, and bone. These various studies have involved using cadavers, clinical methods, and radiological methods. And through these studies, we have found an accepted value for the epithelium and connective tissue attachment, and these values are 0.97 and 1.07 millimeters respectively. Together, if you add these up, they make up the biological width, which we know at average is 2.04. Next slide, please. So in 1961, Gargiulo did a famous study where he took human cadavers ranging from 19 to 50 years of age. It was a histopathological study where he evaluated about 30 jaws and 287 teeth. And what he found was the average biological width was 2.04, and that the connective tissue attachment varied the least, while the junctional epithelium varied the most. Next slide, please. The way that we typically perform studies on biological width is through a process called transgingival probing, also known as bone sounding. This involves taking a periodontal probe, slipping it into the sulcus of the tooth, and taking it all the way down to the bone. This is difficult because it's invasive, and it can also initiate discomfort for patients and requires the use of local anesthetic to the area that is being bone sounded. With new technology today, such as CBCT and intraoral scans, that provides an inviting opportunity for us to evaluate the dentogingival apparatus through a non-invasive method and can give an accurate representation of the dental anatomy. Next slide. So the purpose of our study is to evaluate whether using dual scan technology, so overlaying an intraoral scan with a CBCT, is a valuable method to assessing biological width, as well as exploring the dynamic relationships that are associated with the biological width. Next slide. So this is a retrospective study. The way that we accomplished this was we had patients had existing CBCT scans or would need CBCT scans for implant treatment planning. And we saw these patients from about October of 2022 to March of 2023. With these scans, we had a resultant STL DICOM file that was uploaded to a software called Blue Sky Bio using a best fit algorithm. Our sample size was about 13 patients and equated to about 154 teeth. Since collecting data, we've actually included significantly more patients, so we're about 16 and over 200 teeth now. Next slide. So this is just a good visualization of kind of what it looks like when we have a CBCT scan and the intraoral scan. We combine them. You can see the image is a little bit more clear, and we can see a little bit more of the anatomy. Next slide. So we had several exclusion criteria, mainly because we wanted to focus on individuals that have a healthy periodontium. So we excluded individuals that have uncontrolled systemic conditions, pregnant patients, patients that are taking medications known to cause gingival enlargement, patients that have periodontal disease that is active, or patients that have recession. We also eliminated anything that had scatter on CBCT, commonly due to fixed partial dentures, and then anything with an incomplete intraoral scan that did not accurately represent the area we were looking at was also eliminated. Next slide, please. So the way that we chose the teeth was they were randomly selected between the maxillary and mandibular arch. We chose a central incisor, a lateral incisor, a canine, premolar, and molar. If any of these teeth showed any difficulty in evaluating the intraoral scan, if it didn't capture the area, it was eliminated, and each tooth was evaluated using a cross-sectional view positioned directly mid-facial. Next slide, please. So using dual scan, these were the measurements that we took to eliminate any inter-examiner variation. Dr. Antoine took all of the dual scan measurements, and Dr. Karim took all of the periodontal clinical measurements. So for dual scan, we did tooth length, tooth width, and we evaluated the free gingival margin to the CEJ, seen in letter A, and then the CEJ to the crest of the bone in B, and then A and B together represent the free gingival margin to the crest of the bone. We also evaluated the alveolar bone width, seen in D, and the gingival thickness at the alveolar bone crest. Next slide, please. So for periodontal probing measurements, Dr. Karim was calibrated in this, and he completed this part. So we used a Goldstein probe. A Goldstein probe is a colored probe that moves in 0.5 millimeter increments. And we took a midfacial clinical pocket depth of all of the teeth, and then a midfacial keratinized tissue width of all the teeth. Next slide, please. To calculate the biological width, we used a very specific formula. I'm sure you guys are aware of it, but it is the distance from the free gingival margin to the alveolar crest and subtracted the clinical pocket depth. And then with these measurements, we got an average, and we compared that to the accepted average of 2.04. Next slide. So we wanted to gather a little bit of descriptive statistics for our study. So we just wanted to look at age, pocket depth, keratinized tissue thickness, tooth length, tooth width, the free gingival margin to CEJ, CEJ to bone crest, free gingival margin to bone crest, the biological width, bone thickness, and gingival thickness. Next slide, please. So I'm going to discuss our results now. Next slide, please. These were the mean values at various levels that kind of follow along the descriptive statistics. I'll point out that the average age of our sample size was 51, and the average pocket depth was 1.38. Next slide. So for each tooth, we separated into anterior, canine, and molar for both upper and lower, and then we had mean, average, biological width values for those specific tooth locations, and then we took the average of all the averages. So our average biological width was 1.95 with a range of 1.8 to 2.79. Next slide, please. And I do want to point out that since we have continued the study, we now have 16 patients and over 200 teeth, and the average biological width was 2.048. Next slide, please. Next, we wanted to evaluate the influencing factors of biological width. Specifically, I would like to point out the largest correlation coefficient to biological width was the free gingival margin to the bone crest. And then I would also like to point out aged and keratinized tissue are starred. Oh, can you go back a slide? That one, thank you. Aged and keratinized tissue are starred because they showed statistical insignificance, most likely due to having a lower sample size and not because they have no relation to biological width. Next slide. So this is a graph of all the influencing factors. We found both negative and positive correlations with biological width. negative correlations indicate that as biological width increases, this factor would decrease, so they move in opposite directions. The negative correlations were pocket depth, bone thickness, tissue width, and gingival thickness. To describe this a little better, I will describe to you how pocket depth, the larger it is, the smaller the biological width would be. If you can recall the formula that we used to calculate biological width, being the free gingival margin to the crest of the bone, subtracting the pocket depth, you can see that the larger the pocket depth, the smaller the biological width would be. So for negative correlations, a lot of it has to do with less space capable for the biological width to exist. For the positive correlations, we found tooth length, free gingival margin to CEJ, CEJ to bone crest, and free gingival margin to bone crest. So the greater these values are, the greater the biological width also is, indicating more space for the biological width to exist. Next slide, please. Next, we wanted to evaluate a variety of influencing factors based on tooth type and tooth location. So we looked at the relationship between tooth type and biological width, keratinized tissue, gingival thickness, and bone thickness. Next slide, please. So for biological width, there was a significant relationship between biological width based on where it is located in the mouth. So for the largest biological width, it was determined to be the lower canines, followed by lower anteriors and upper anteriors. And the smallest biological width was found to be the upper posteriors, followed by lower posterior and upper canine. Next slide. Next, we evaluated the keratinized tissue and the relationship between that based on tooth type and location. There was a significant relationship, especially in the maxillary rather than the mandibular. The largest amount of keratinized gingival tissue was seen in the upper anterior area, followed by the upper canine and the upper posterior areas. And the smallest amount of keratinized tissue was in the lower canine, followed by the lower posterior and lower anterior. Next slide, please. And then we evaluated gingival thickness based on tooth type, and the thickest gingival tissue was seen in the upper posteriors, followed by lower posterior and upper anterior, and the thinnest gingival tissue was the lower anterior region, followed by the lower canine and upper canine. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we evaluated bone thickness based on tooth type and location. There was a significant relationship, and the thickest bone was seen in the upper posterior region, followed by the upper canine and upper anterior, and then the thinnest bone was seen in the lower anterior, followed by the lower canine and lower posterior. So to kind of sum this up a little bit, I don't know if you recall, but the biological width was seen to be the smallest in the lower canine region, and then lower anteriors also had thinner bone and thinner gingival tissue, while larger biological width was seen in upper posteriors, and they have thicker tissue and thicker bone. So I wanted to, next slide please. We also wanted to evaluate the bone thickness in the gingival tissue and see how that relates to the biological width. So there was a significant positive correlation between tissue and bone. So we know that the thicker the bone, the thicker the tissue, and vice versa. And then that positively correlates with the biological width. Next slide, please. So I'm going to end this presentation on discussion about noteworthy relationships. So we know that longer teeth that typically have thinner gingiva and thinner bone are going to have a larger distance between the CEJ and the bone, and that leads to more space for the biological width. And so this means that a thin gingival phenotype is always associated with a larger biological width and vice versa. Next slide. And then we know that a thick gingival phenotype is going to be characterized by thick gingival tissue, a larger amount of keratinized tissue, and thick bone, and these typically interrelate. So the dimensions of the bone width, the keratinized tissue, and the bone and gingival thickness are affected significantly by tooth type and tooth location. Next slide, please. So to the best of our knowledge, this is kind of one of the first studies that uses the St. Louis DICOM file in correlation with periodontal probing depths to evaluate co-founding factors digitally. And so I want to point out that the biological width is not necessarily a fixed number. It can vary based on individuals, on bone thickness, on soft tissue thickness, and on the location between the bone crest in relation to the CEJ and gingival margin. So I would challenge using the 2.04 millimeter accepted average, since biological width can vary based on tooth location and other factors. This is important because we know the role of restorative dentistry in restoring aesthetics, function, and that can significantly be affected if the periodontal health is not evaluated beforehand. So it's recommended that you take a full evaluation of the periodontal health of teeth before considering anything about crown root lengthening and some gingival restorations. This is to avoid initiating iatrogenic periodontal disease, which we know in a thinner gingival biotype can cause recession. And so it's very, very strongly recommended that you take that into account. And then lastly, thick bone, thick gingiva, and wide keratinized tissue seem to come in a package deal, which is called a thick gingival biotype. Next slide, please. So we have continued this research, and we will continue collecting data with more patients, but looking ahead, it would be recommended to do a study on the age and biological width, to include a larger sample size, and then to include other factors such as altered passive eruption. These are our references. Next slide. And then next slide. Acknowledgements to our biostatistician, Mary Wang, and then Dr. Omar, and then all our faculty members that helped along the way. Thank you.
Hi. Hello. Okay, it's on. Sorry. I always it seems to me, I always was taught over the years that 2.04 millimeters was almost like a standard, an absolute, and that never made sense to me. I would have always suspected more now the technology's here, what your research is showing, but that got me curious. Was I correct in that assumption that that's how it was taught, or did I just hear that? Was that always thought to be kind of a pretty absolute thing over the years prior to this technology?
Yeah, I would say since the 1961 study that the 2.04 has kind of been an accepted value that's been used, especially with restorative dentistry. But since there are new opportunities to evaluate that and challenge that, I would say that it should no longer be an accepted value, and that each tooth should be evaluated individually on a specific basis.
Thank you.
Caroline, thank you for an excellent presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear.
Yes?
Yeah.
I just have a quick question. So the digital assessment of the biologic width, was that validated? Because you did both, right? You did the bone sounding as well as the digital and compared the two?
We did not do bone sounding.
Okay.
The point of this research was to investigate whether dual scan technology can be used in place of the conventional bone sounding method, which our research shows that it is.
Okay, but it was not compared to bone sounding in the same study?
It's compared to the results from bone sounding. So we compared our average biological width with the average biological width that was determined through bone sounding.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm kind of slow on the uptake. Can you, and don't go back to the slide, but can you give us the takeaways, the high points of the positive and negative correlation slide? You know, this watch for this, or how do we use that seeing our patients?
So I would say the biggest takeaway from this is that biological width varies based on tooth location, and this is especially important for anterior teeth. So we know that anterior teeth typically show thinner gingiva and thinner bone, and we know that gingiva thickness and bone is negatively associated with biological width. So as those decrease, the biological width increases. And so when planning a restoration, let's say on the lower anterior teeth, we know that maybe the biological width is a little bit larger because there's more space for it. And so it might be larger than 2.4, and so you might not be as safe as you think you are when planning subgingival restorations or crown root lengthening.